Hello. Today my topic is fiscal policies in India, its objectives and fiscal responsibilities. This is a very important topic to be taught. Why? Because fiscal policy is used for the stabilization of the economy and to maintain economic growth. You can state it in this way that government uses fiscal policies or the various tools of fiscal policy which I will be telling later to maintain the sustained economic growth and to maintain the economic stability. Right. So, in the beginning, let me start with the definition of fiscal policies. Fiscal policy deals with the taxation and government expenditure. That means two important tools I've already stated: taxation and expenditure policies of the government. For maintaining economic stability, will only the fiscal policy matter? No, there are two important tools. One is fiscal policy and monetary policy. The two acts not in the similar ways, differently, but the two have the same purpose of maintaining the economic growth as well as sustainability. And there are definitely the interconnectedness between the two policies. When monetary policy is used, that targets the money supply and affects the economy indirectly through administration of interest rate and bank rate policies, etc. Indirect impact, indirectly affect. But in case of fiscal policy, which works through aggregate demand and aggregate supply channel, uses tools for direct as well as indirect influence of the economy. That means directly as well as indirectly. Directly through public expenditure, directly through government spending. You can say government spending means you can say generation of employment. That means income generation. That means people spending more as well as indirectly by cutting down the tax rate. When government does it in times of recession, just you have seen when pandemic attacks in the economy. Every one of us faces that impact. Loss of employment, loss of income. Then government intervenes by transferring cash transfer, so that people can spend more. People can consume. Economy can boost up. If people gets employment, then obviously income is generated, as well as cutting down the tax rate. I said that fiscal policy can directly influences the economy. How? What is the root? What is the macroeconomics behind it? That is, the macroeconomic identity. What is that? Basic national income identity. Gross national income is the sum total of, from your macroeconomic textbook, that gross national income is decomposed into the four ways: consumption, expenditure and consumption or consumer expenditure, investment expenditure, government purchases of goods and services, and net export. So definitely government control GDP directly. Economic growth directly impact, and directly impact G also. G is at your right hand side. GDP is The value of final goods and services, that is the GDP, which placed in your left-hand side. So government affects economy directly. But other components, see how does government affect this? Taxation. So this is the aggregate impact of the economy, aggregate influence of the economy, and the supply-demand channel. So the role of the fiscal policy is to maintain the economic stability by generation of employment, to maintain the economic growth by providing more employment, maintain the equality of income distribution by generation of resources, by redistribution of resources. These are the three main aspects, three main roles of the fiscal policy. Coming to the types of fiscal policy. Types of fiscal policy, there are three types of fiscal policy. One is known as expansionary fiscal policy. Second is known as contractionary fiscal policy. And third is known as fiscal neutral process. Starting with the third one, fiscal neutral process. What is fiscal neutral process? As the coin directly suggests, that it is the balanced budget. Government expenditure equals government receipt. No surplus, no deficit. Fine enough. It's a balanced budget. Difficult to attain, of course. Now, what is expansionary fiscal policy? Expansionary fiscal policy, just see the terms. Expansionary fiscal policy. Then government needs to expend. Expenditure greater than receipts. That is called deficit budget, right? And you know, in times of recession, when I started with the recession and pandemic, government follows expansionary fiscal policies to directly influence the demand, to directly raise the demand, okay? To directly increase the productive resources of the economy. That is important, you know. And what is contractionary fiscal policy? Now, you can easily argue that it's just when receipts government is in happy mood. Receipt is greater than expenditure. What does it mean? Receipt is greater than expenditure when? That is surplus budget. Okay. So these are the three types of fiscal policies. What are the main objectives? Main objectives of fiscal policy can be categorized in three ways. In short, in three ways. I'm telling you in short. First, to achieve higher economic growth. Second, of course, to achieve price stability. Third, to maintain the equality of resource distribution so that inequality can be reduced. In Indian economy, we are very much bothered with the inequality of the accessible resource. How that could be attained? Higher economic growth, I always tell you, or you can get through my lecture, that management of budget is required for achieving the correct rate of growth, intended rate of growth. Okay. Reduction of inequality, removal of inequality. I don't know inequality can be removed or not. That is a very debatable question. So let me modify myself as removal of inequality. What is that? How that can be attained? You can suggest me one thing, that ma'am, if you cut down the if you cut down the tax rates on the vulnerable people, okay, or if you tax more the rich people, then the redistribution can easily occur. So that, of course, that may be a way. Another way you can argue that, ma'am, try to control the consumption on luxury item by putting higher tax rate on the luxury items. That can also be done. So removal of inequality is basically how the vulnerables can be addressed. Okay. So these are the three objectives of fiscal policies. So much so on this aspect. So now the next is the operations itself. And in that case, let me first tell you other necessary concepts of fiscal policy. The very basic concepts of fiscal policy, perhaps you are well known about it, but when we deal with Indian economics and we are engaged we will be engaged ourselves in some kind of research work, then you will have to calculate it. Just mere saying that surplus budget, deficit budget, okay, capital receipt, capital expenditure, it is more, it is less, doesn't really mean anything. You have to prove it. For this matter, let me tell you basic concepts. These are necessary for you to calculate on the basis of Indian economic data what is happening in India. Fiscal policy is subdivided into three parts. One is public expenditure. The next one is receipt, government receipt, government expenditure, government receipt. Third one is public debt. Let me first start with capital receipt. Capital receipt. So capital receipt, it has direct impact on government's asset liability position, how it performs. This is once again decomposed into two parts. One is date creating, another is non-date creating. Okay. So what is date creating? Date creating means sale of government securities. Right? When government sells securities, assets, then it takes money from the people or otherwise. And what is non-date creating? Non-date creating is just taking money from other sources. This is non-date creating. Okay. Capital receipt occurs once, only once. One time receipt. And what is capital expenditure then? Just the opposite. Acquisition of assets, acquisition of securities. These occurs again only once. Okay, not in continuum. Okay. That means you can say that when capital expenditure rises, that means government expenditure rises. Right? That means private expenditure definitely is in a declining trend. That's why capital expenditure rises. The revenue deficit, capital expenditure also affects government's asset liability position. Right. Then what is revenue receipt? It is, first of all, it is regular in nature. Right. Revenue receipts also regular in nature. Both revenue receipts and revenue expenditures are regular in nature. Revenue receipts, one example, that is when government getting money from tax revenues. I'm just giving you one example. And there may be there may be enormity of examples. Enough examples are there, but just to start with tax revenue, I'm giving just one example. Tax revenues. And secondly, revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure means you can say fees, pensions, etc. Now, the next important thing is where from this receipts and expenditure goes or comes. There are 3 accounts which can manage all the government receipts and all the government expenditure. That means the receipts and expenditure in terms of capital expenditure, capital receipt, revenue expenditure, revenue receipts. There are 3 funds: Consolidated Fund of India, Contingency Fund of India, and Public Accounts of India, PAI. Consolidated Fund of India, where all revenues, I mean capital expenditure, capital receipts like that, are debited. Withdrawal of money from this account needs the permission of the Parliament. Regarding Contingency Fund of India, the name suggests, bear in mind contingency. Contingency, what does it mean? Contingency means necessary expenditure. In case of government, President manages this. I mean, government needs to take the permission of the President of India. I mean, permission is obtained from President of India, who in its turn consults with Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And the third one is PAI. So what is PAI? PAI is concerned with pension fund, small savings. You are familiar with this. And that does not require any permission from anyone, either not from the President, not from the Parliament. Next comes deficit indicator. Fiscal deficit, primary deficit, revenue deficit, and yet another deficit. Bear in mind, effective revenue deficit. Rangarajan Committee, you might hear his name. Rangarajan Committee used it. Okay. So you know what gross fiscal deficit, GFD in short, or fiscal deficit, you can say, means the definition of fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit means total expenditure minus total receipt. It's not so simple. Total expenditure means capital expenditure, revenue expenditure, mind it. TE is the sum total of KE, capital expenditure, and revenue expenditure, RE. What is TR? Same way. So, you say RE and the in receipt side, capital receipt, revenue receipt. So, there are RR. Then if you subtract RE from RR, what do you get? Revenue deficit. So you can define it in this way: revenue deficit, and then capital expenditure, then capital receipt. But a little modification. That is, capital receipt other than borrowing. Okay. So you can write it in this way also, that revenue deficit plus capital expenditure plus capital receipt other than borrowing. You can define it in this way also. It depends on the work you are doing in your project work, which definition to apply. You can modify it in different ways also. I'll tell you later when time comes, right? So now come to the primary deficit. If you subtract net interest liability of government from your GFD, then you get primary deficit. One thing I missed in case of GFD. Now, in case of GFD, you know GFD is very important to study the fiscal health of the economy. PD is important to study the current fiscal position of the economy. So mind it, you have to subtract the net interest liability from GFD to get primary deficit. And what is revenue deficit? It's very simple. It's very simple. Revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt. And then what is ERD? ERD is a new concept. Very important to aspect whether government expenditure which government is doing, that is actually helpful or not, suitable or not, effect and the fiscal position alarming or not. This is effective revenue deficit is when you subtract grants in aid for capital expenditure from revenue deficit. I mean, don't misuse fund. Whether government is misutilizing the fund or utilizing the fund properly, that means proper utilization of funds, proper management of deficit is rests on this issue. I'm moving on to fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility is very much concerned with maintenance of fiscal health, fiscal stability, and when these two can be achieved, then obviously the growth will occur. So center has certain power, state has certain power, and municipal bodies have certain power, and all the three are integrated. You might be noting that always in your newspaper you might have been read that center-state financial resources, center-state relation, that comes under fiscal responsibility. So just I'm in a nutshell giving you the principles of fiscal responsibilities. Fiscal responsibilities follow three principles, right? One is fiscal equivalence, principle of maintaining fiscal equivalence. The second is the theorem of decentralization theorem. And the third is subsidiary principle. What is fiscal equivalence? Fiscal equivalence is when the political jurisdiction matches with the benefit, and when political jurisdiction overlaps the benefits, right? Then marginal benefit equals marginal cost, right? And then when it is equalized each other, you know the provision of public service, public goods will be maximized. You have get an idea from your public finance. And we follow the law of principle of correspondence that is coined by Oates. He said that maintain separate jurisdiction for separate provision, I mean maintenance of separate jurisdiction for separate public services. I mean, see who will be utilizing it. So set your target people who will get the provision of public, who will get the public service, who will be getting, and then maintain the separate jurisdiction for separate public service. Second is decentralization. I mean, for minimum geographical area, use separate provision of public good, controlled by separate people. And third is, so this is hierarchical structure, then third is subsidiary principle. Subsidiary principle is also maintains the hierarchy. That means particular group, you cut down the sections and search for the vulnerables who needs it. Okay, for whom to distribute. So these are the principles. For that, there are several laws, FRBM laws. FRBM laws 2003 is very important. That is very important. And finally, encasing committee report, that is also important. 15th Finance Commission. Okay. So quickly now, see what happens in India case. I mean Indian structure, Indian trend analysis of financing pattern and deficit pattern. Trend analysis can give you the idea of the financing pattern, the trend analysis, whether it is on uptrend, whether it is fluctuating, whether it is downward sloping. So trend analysis is very important. You just collect data on different deficits. The deficit data are available from, I just said you that RBI report handbook of Indian economy, economic survey, Indian public service, Indian public statistics, union budget, financing data are also available. And in that, when you take the combined deficit of state government and central government as percentage to GDP, you see the financing, the expenditures are on rising trend. So deficits are rising. But take an average, then you see over time, although it is fluctuating, but if your initial point is, say, 2009, 2010, then at that time deficit was higher. This is about deficit. In case of financing, the same pattern follows. What follows? That why deficit started from a highest, then fluctuates. Falls, then rises, then falls, then rises. And if the terminal point is 2009, 2020, it again higher, but not at that level which reached in 2009, 2010. Okay. In case of that is, financing pattern and deficit. If you break down in center and state, in case of center, the deficit ratio is like your inverted bowl. But in case of state, deficit as percentage to GDP, it is fluctuating. Set 4-time point. Take 4-time point or 2011 to 2014, then take average. 2014 to 2017, take average. You see, it is like, V, then inverted B, then V. That means it is fluctuating but finally rising. Quite interesting picture. Which way you are taking obviously gives you the health of your, the fiscal health. And fiscal health is the health of the economy. Fiscal health is giving you the idea of how the economy is performing. And when you find out the reason, then reason gives you the idea where the macroeconomic shocks occurred, when fiscal deficit rises, when financing pattern rises. When financing pattern rises and both receipts are rises, then which rises more? Because deficits are rising. What is the reason behind it? Go through your Indian economics to find out the reason. This is the important issues of fiscal policy for which you can get an idea whether your economy is pursuing economic growth with stability. And remember your shock point. I mean your ups and downs. I mean your peaks and trough. And please find from your economic book, economic survey, and other data sources the reason behind that. I mean, if you take the data on 2008, where global financial crisis has emerged, if you take the data on pandemic period, then data would have been different. So try to match the trend with the economic facts prevailing at that time. And then see what steps government really takes. Whether that policy, then your policy implication will tell you. I mean, try to judge the policy with your own way, whether the policy is correct or not. Because in that way, you are also, being an economist, you are also helping the government. Okay, with that, I finish my lecture. And if there are questions, definitely that will be addressed later. I will encourage you to form questions because questions will improve your research potential, and that way it also help the government itself. Thank you.